next instalment of the science seminar series. I'll introduce Philip in a moment, but just a couple of things just very briefly. Thank you all for coming. It's an excellent turnout. The numbers that we're getting to these are slowly increasing. We could probably even do some sort of trend analysis or something if we wanted to, but it certainly looks like there's more people coming along to each one, and that's really, really positive. So thank you for taking the time. Just a bit of health and safety stuff. You'll have noticed a bit of disruption going on with some sort of renovation. So in the event of an emergency, the key things to remember is that there's two exits. Obviously the one at the front here, which I guess we could say would be the main exit for everybody. It's not recommended that you go down the central combination of stairs, escalators, etc. But if you're at the back of the room, you can go straight through the foyer area into the room, which mirrors this one on the other side there. And there's an exit just like that on the far wall, which takes you directly outside. So those are probably the two quickest ways to go. Just in the event of an earthquake, obviously fairly standard stuff with the drop, cover and hold. And the only other thing that they recommend in this building is try to avoid the temptation to look out the window, because those large glass windows are recognised as a bit of a hazard. So try to not look out the window. Yeah. So we're talking about wetlands today, so it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Philip Grove. Phil has been a land resources scientist, ecologist with ECAM for about 15 years. Prior to that, he completed a PhD from the botany department down in Otago. So I'll pretty much hand over to him. We will hopefully get a good discussion going at the end. If there's any absolute dire need for you to seek some clarification or something through the presentation, then please feel free to put your hand up. But otherwise, if we can wait till the end, that would be great. We should have time, but we've programmed time at the end to have a good discussion. So yeah, hopefully that will take place. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Robert Jen. Thanks for taking the time to come along, as Brody said. It's an ambitious title. I didn't select it myself, but I couldn't think of a better one, so thanks to Cons for that. What I'll try and cover today is really more of an introduction to the topic of wetlands. What is a wetland? I'll start again if it's a bit quiet. What I'll cover today is really more of an introduction. What is a wetland? The types of wetlands we have in the Canterbury region, the values of wetlands in terms of ecosystem health services and biodiversity, and so the changes that have taken place to Canterbury Wetlands, in particular the sort of extent, and I'll sort of divide that up into what I'll call the sort of historic period, which is basically from sort of the time of European settlement up until maybe the 1980s thereabouts. And then also look at sort of what's been going on in the wetlands of the region sort of more recently in the last 20 years or so. And then I'll just quickly discuss our current sort of survey and monitoring program that myself and my team carry out around wetlands, and try and wrap up with what it means in a regional and national perspective. And if that doesn't tell you everything you need or even want to know about wetlands, then as Brody said, there'll be time at the end for some questions. So what is a wetland? It's just a collective name for bogs, swamps, the wet margins of rivers, ponds, lakes, lagoons and estuaries. And can be large or small, natural or man-made, permanently or intermittently wet. The water can be fresh or brackish or saline. And the source of the water can be groundwater, rainwater, surface flows or seawater. That is supposed to be a view of Raupo Bay on Banks Peninsula, and the accompanying blurb is that the region has a wide range of wetland habitats that occur from the Alps down to the sea. So here's the coastal end of that spectrum, and you probably can't see it, but what it was supposed to show was just the wetlands associated with the riparian habitats here, and also the wetland areas and the coastal wetlands here and behind the dunes. So 2 sort of coastal wetland and riparian wetland systems. And another example up in the mountains in the montane region, a large peat bog wetland type. So we've got some wonderful wetlands in the natural areas or less modified areas, but they're also common and widespread through our more developed rural and urban landscapes. So lots of us will have seen sort of sites like this as you drive along the road, particularly as you sort of get into the foothill parts of the region, and you'll commonly see at the base of hills these wetlands, areas where groundwater emerges at the base of the hill slope, and also the surface water flow. And so here we've got a small roadside swamp on farmland. So there's the RMA definition of a wetland. I'll give you a minute to read that lucid prose. So the key points, I guess, to take from it are that the wetland doesn't have to be permanently wet, but it must support a natural ecosystem adapted to wet conditions. So what that generally means is certain types of plants and animals. And the RMA definition doesn't explicitly say that those plants and animals have to be indigenous species. So a wetland can be made up of introduced plants such as willow trees, introduced animals such as mallard ducks. It still fits the RMA definition of wetland. So it's, as you can see, quite a broad definition, and it actually includes places that, or situations that might not widely be recognised as wetlands. So here we go, a braided river, under that definition, it is a type of wetland. Similarly, spring-fed streams, a type of wetland. And the large river mouth lagoon or hapua that we see at the mouth of our braided rivers, another wetland type, relatively, well, not unique to Canterbury, but certainly a bit of a feature of Canterbury and not so common in other parts of the country. Just interesting to see on the inland side of this hapua is vegetated, wetland vegetation, flax and sedges and rushes, but notice on the beach side, largely unvegetated, just reflecting the dynamic nature of that sort of coastal beach barrier situation. But still obviously important in terms of the formation of the wetland habitat. Another type of wetland, just the tidal mudflats on our estuaries. And here's a wetland that probably wouldn't strike you as obvious. It's a grassy farm paddock in the summer, and in the winter it's an extensive area of shallow water which is feeding habitat for thousands and thousands of birds, mostly native birds, waders and waterfowl. So there's been a bit of work over the last few years in trying to sort of develop a classification system for wetlands to try and make sense of all this wide range of habitats and types and vegetation and species that live in them. And the main driver, it's a sort of a hierarchical classification system developed by botanists and wetland ecologists. And it's a hierarchical classification, so at the top, the main driver of wetland classification is hydrology. That's what's important to wetlands, it's the water. So what we start with is what we call the hydro system. Is it a riverine or lacustrine, estuarine or palestrine hydro system? And that just means, is the dominant source of the wetland water a river, a lake, seawater or estuary, or palestrine, which I'll just explain. The others hopefully are reasonably obvious, but palestrine just means anything other than river, lake or sea. So groundwater, rainwater, overland flow, those are the dominant water sources of palestrine wetlands. So you've got a water source. The other sort of critical thing in terms of wetland hydrology is the water, the depth, the periodicity. So is the water deep? Is it shallow? Do levels fluctuate? How much do they fluctuate? Do they fluctuate on a regular basis like tides? Do they fluctuate on a regular basis like seasons? Or is it rather irregular? So all these different things are all considerations in terms of the hydrology that drives the wetlands and that influences the species, the type of wetland habitat and the species that will occupy it. So just looking a bit more closely at palestrine wetlands, which is what my team focuses on, because obviously we have a surface water ecologists in our science group as well, who spend a lot of time looking at rivers and lakes, and also coastal estuaries. So looking just at the palestrine wetlands a bit more closely, what you'll see along the top is wetland class, and this follows on from this wetland classification system I mentioned, and what's happened is that the guys who put this together sort of co-opted some of the common names for wetlands, which you can see there. These are all just, you know, a variety of terms of common usage, and given them a sort of specific technical or scientific application. So at one end of the extreme or spectrum you have bog, and then fen, swamp and marsh. And if you just sort of read through, you can see that there's gradients in terms of the water source, the flow and fluctuation, the nutrient status, pH and peat content. So in the top corner you've got a bog, its water source is rainfall. The water levels within the wetland don't fluctuate a great deal. It's low nutrient status, high pH, peat. And then you can see the marsh at the other end of the spectrum tends to be on mineral soils, doesn't form peat. Water levels fluctuate, that's what defines a marsh, and it's generally a high nutrient status. And this is just a bit of I'll just go through some examples in the Canterbury context of these wetland classes. This is a bog. This is a site, this is the Tekapo military defence area as it happens, and it's got some wonderful and very extensive wetlands in it. And so this bog, as I said before, it receives its water supply from precipitation, so rain, mist and snow. It doesn't have groundwater or any nutrients from adjacent or underlying mineral soils, so they're very low in nutrients. They lie on peat, acid, poorly aerated, poorly drained. The water table is pretty constant and close to or just above the ground surface. So bogs mostly occur on level ground or gentle slopes, and they have a variety of vegetation on them. It can be mosses, sphagnum or peat moss is the characteristic bog species, but also lichens and various vascular plants, cushion plants, sedges, grasses, rushes, even shrubs and trees in some situations. Now, bogs are relatively uncommon in Canterbury because their formation relies on a combination of high rainfall and gentle topography. So obviously in Canterbury, the two don't often go together. We have high rainfall areas, but they tend to be in the steep mountain lands. This is a picture of or an example of a fen, the second of the main wetland class, palustrite wetland classes. And it's covered in red tussock, and it's on the camera and fan, just looking down towards Lake Huron. So fen is classed sort of between a bog and a swamp. It's intermediate. Fens are easy, but they also receive groundwater and nutrients from adjacent soils, and they have therefore they have moderate fertility, low to moderate acidity. And again, the water table is relatively constant, usually close to or just below the surface. And a fen often lies on slight slopes, and plants that favour them are sedges, ferns, tall herbs, scrub and tussock grasses, as you see here. So red tussock and bulrush fens are quite widespread, particularly in the high country basins of the region. That's scarcely visible to me, I imagine you apologise for that. That's a swamp, and that's a picture of Otakaikino. The swamp gets a relatively rich supply of nutrients because its main water source, well, it's still largely groundwater fed, but it tends to be at the bottom end of catchment, so the groundwater has picked up more nutrients, and also has a lot of overland flow coming into it, which obviously carries sediment nutrients from nearby land. So swamps usually lie on a mix of mineral and peat substrates, and they'll often have, again, the water table is often above the ground in places, but it may be below the ground in other places. There'll be often channels of open water within the swamp. Water levels in a swamp tend to fluctuate a bit more than they do in fens and bogs, but they still are pretty wet most of the time, and that's why they can still form peat. So swamps usually occur in basins, valley floors, deltas and plains. And these, particularly in lowland Canterbury, were formerly the most extensive wetland type, but they've been also most greatly reduced. And finally, a marsh. A marsh has mainly mineral soil and actually has quite good drainage. So it's fed by surface water, and the water levels fluctuate. So when there's a rainfall or a flood event and river levels in a lake or river, water levels in a lake or river rise, they flood the surrounding land, and then that land drains away again. That's a marsh habitat. So they're often flooded by standing or slowly moving water. They're medium to high fertility, mainly occur on gentle slopes, especially along the margins of valleys and beside rivers and lakes. And vegetation mostly often rushland, grasses, sedges and herbs. just one more wetland type, a favourite of mine is the coastal salt marsh. So a special type of marsh habitat where the hydrological regime is saline or brackish water that also fluctuates in levels. So salt marsh, fluctuating water levels in saline or brackish. The salinity also fluctuates. And these fluctuations in water level may be tidal, such as in the Avon Heathcote estuary or saltwater creek here, or they may be non-tidal, such as the salt marsh habitats around Waihora and Wainurunga. So those areas, they're periodically open to the sea, but obviously not on tidal cycles, just intermittently. But they get incursions of seawater, and so we still get salt marsh vegetation developing around the margins. So just the ecosystem values and ecosystem services of wetlands. Wetlands are water bodies, the same as streams, rivers and lakes, and they contribute and are part of the overall catchment hydrology, just like there's other water bodies. And they play an important role in water quantity and quality of the catchment as a whole. Like other water bodies, they have a role in catchment water storage and flood attenuation. And wetlands in riparian and margin areas, the wetland plants sort of hold the soil together, so they reduce erosion, particularly during sort of wind or flood events. And wetland plants trap the sediment that's suspended in water, so they help to improve water quality in that way. And then we also get nutrients that enter waterways through groundwater, through surface runoff, and through direct effluent discharges. The wetland vegetation will use some of these nutrients for growth, and the other thing is that the bacteria that live in wetland soils are also able to remove soluble nitrates from water and convert it to an ammonia or nitrogen gas, so it gets taken out of water and released into the atmosphere. So these water purification capabilities that wetlands have are pretty well recognised now, and they're routinely utilised in developing constructed wetlands to manage stormwater and treat effluent or wastewater. So yeah, a lot of sort of ecosystem service and just values for wetlands as a habitat. It's important to recognise that even if the wetland is dominated by introduced plant species, like this one in the slide here, it still has those same values in terms of its ecosystem services, like protecting water quality and also providing habitat for native animals, fish, birds, and vertebrates. And of course, wetlands have habitat and biodiversity values as well. So as I just said, they provide habitat for indigenous species, including many threatened species. And what you see in wetlands is quite a range of plants and animals. You'll get your wetland specialists, the plants and animals that only live in wetlands, but you'll also get other species, some plants, but particularly animals that utilise wetlands as well as other habitats. So the slide shows another lowland wetland that's again is dominated by exotic hardwood trees, willows and poplars and alders. But you can't see, but take my word for it, there is in the understory an abundance of native plants in this site, native sedges, ferns, rushes, and even shrubs and trees. So there's a lot of native flora in this wetland, even though it's dominated by introduced willows, and it's also excellent habitat for native wildlife. And just a few quick slides of different sorts of wetland habitats and the plants and animals in them. This is a small wetland in a coastal dune slack. So a dune slack is the hollow between a series of dunes along the coastline. So you've got two dunes and then a hollow between them, and depending on the conditions, they'll often develop as wetland habitats. So this one here is in South Canterbury, just across the way from Wainona Lagoon, and in the interdune slack is a salt marsh herb field that's developed, and it's got a rather the yellow-eyed penguin there, which is not a typical wetland species. It's made its way up from Otago for some reason, but just to illustrate, I guess, that quite a wide variety of particularly birds will visit wetlands at times. And as I mentioned before, the wetlands often contain specialised species that do best in certain conditions. So you will often see plants that can cope with either sort of environmentally extreme conditions or large fluctuations in the conditions, such as salinity levels, water levels, alternating sort of sequences of dry and wet conditions. So the slide here is in the Green Park Sands area, and it's a very high salinity salt marsh vegetation, what we call hypersaline. So these areas trap the lake water when the lake's high, and then the lake level drops. The lake water ponds in these hollows, and then it slowly evaporates. And the salt, as you can imagine, gets highly concentrated, so it becomes a lot more salty than even seawater. The soils also become very saline, to the point where there's only 2 species of plant that will grow in these conditions, and there they are. There's the glasswort herb and the native saltgrass, Puxinalia. But what we'll frequently observe with wetlands, and it's not surprising, I guess, is that with the greater diversity of habitats, there's a greater diversity of species assemblages, communities, and species themselves. So wetlands are often great places to see these sort of ecological gradients, where you get sort of the meeting of 2 different systems, say the coastal system meets the land, or the land meets a lake or river. You get what's called an ecotone, or you'll get these environmental gradients along elevation, inundation, salinity regimes. And these can be quite subtle, so relatively low level changes can have quite a large influence in terms of, well, vegetation patterns, species composition. So this is a slide again of Waihora, and you can see from it that just the very slight changes in elevation of just a few centimetres as you go step down towards the lake have got quite different plant communities in them. From the open lake water, then through to the sort of salt marsh herb field, and then at the slightly higher levels, the grassland and rushland, and then the salt marsh ribbonwood shrub on the higher areas. So we get, a diversity of wetland types, and some wetlands, such as bogs that I mentioned before, and ephemeral tarns, are low nutrient and low biological productivity systems, but they often have very high diversity of species. And then you'll get other types of wetlands, such as lowland swamps, coastal lagoons, and estuaries. They may have less species diversity in terms of particularly their plant species composition, but they often have very high biological productivity and support large populations of invertebrates, fish, and birds, as well as large biomass of plants, such as raupo, oi, those sorts of species that form quite extensive stands in these sorts of high productivity environments. Well, that's the sort of the values and the flora and fauna of wetlands. Now I'm just going to talk a bit about changes that have happened to wetlands in Canterbury, particularly since European settlement. So the map here is basically cribbed for Canterbury region from what's called the Freshwater Ecosystems of New Zealand Wetland GIS layer. So it's a national wetland database, if you will, and they did a historic wetland extent, which was baseline sort of around about 1840, and then what they call current wetlands, and the baseline was about year 2000. That was the imagery and sort of source material they used to develop that current wetland map. So it's a bit out of date now, obviously. Just note that this, as suggested by the name freshwater ecosystems, it only deals with freshwater wetlands, so they're not trying to show the extent of coastal or estuarine wetland systems in this exercise. But what you can see, what's immediately apparent is that there's been a very large reduction in extent of freshwater wetlands in Canterbury since European settlement. If you actually just compare it numerically, it works out to be an 89% reduction from what was there in 1840 and what fence is here now, or at least in the year 2000. So, and as you can also see, the loss of wetlands has been concentrated on the low plains, and what was enormous areas of freshwater wetland are now largely gone. And you'll also see that the freshwater wetland extent, it has been somewhat reduced, but has persisted within the western half of the region. So the foothills, the intermountain basins, and high country wetlands have been reduced to some extent, but are certainly much more representative of the pre-European extent. And just note that this is just an indicative layer from a national database. It's not comprehensive, doesn't cover every wetland in the region, and it's got accuracy limitations, doesn't identify small wetlands, and as I mentioned before, it doesn't really deal with coastal wetlands in any detail. So what we did in my team a few years ago, back in 2010, was have a closer look at the sort of more recent trends in wetland extent across the region, and we started with the so-called current wetland layer from fens, and then looked at those sites a bit more closely in terms of just looking at time series satellite imagery and aerial photos. And what we found from that study, the blue is just showing the fens wetlands, and then the ones that have been sort of highlighted in red were wetland areas that were subject to change over our monitoring interval, which was 1990 to 2008. So while most of the past, that is up till about 1990, wetland loss was from the low plains, the wetland reduction saw more recently, over the last 20 or so years, 20, 25 years, has actually been concentrated in the western half of the region, in the foothills, the intermontane basins, and valley floors of the Canterbury High Country. So Lees Valley, Ashburton Lakes, Upper Rangitata Valley, and the Mackenzie Basin are some areas where there's been some quite substantial examples of wetland reduction over this more recent monitoring period. And it's associated, of course, with the general land use intensification that's going on in these parts of the region. So this is just one example of how we sort of went about this. And you can see 1990, 98, 2001, 2008, so the satellite imagery that we looked at. And then just an aerial photo from 2005, so you can see quite clearly. The blue line is the wetland as it was in the FENS database, and you can see the sort of western two-thirds of the wetland have certainly been greatly reduced. There's a little bit of wetland vegetation remaining in this part of it. That's a Lees Valley example. So we sort of just had just a quick look at sort of or stab at the causes of wetland reduction from as part of this report, and again, it's really just from looking at aerial photos and satellites. So it's a preliminary, very much preliminary sort of assessment, but you can just see that it's often existing drains that have been put in maybe historically, but they've been maintained or extended in more recent times. That's had a big impact in terms of causing further wetland reduction. New drains have gone in other places. Cultivation, vegetation clearance, installation of centre pivots. A few sites where exotic forestry establishment seem to impact on wetlands, and also wild and conifer spread. Inundation, creation maybe of dams, that sort of thing, and then sort of building and urban development. So yeah, generally drainage and clearing of wetlands for farmland, together with reclamation for urban and industrial use, have been the principal agents of this ongoing wetland loss. And I'll just quickly talk about our wetland survey and monitoring program. And you'll be getting used to the sight of this map now. The blue, yet again, is the Freshwater Ecosystems of New Zealand wetland database. So that was in terms of developing sort of like a regional wetland inventory, we decided to use that as our starting point, that GIS layer, and then what we've been doing over the last 10 or 12 years is a program of ground survey to progressively add to, correct and update this information. So this map just shows where we've got to at present. The red areas are the ones that we've actually ground surveyed, and what our sort of procedure is to go out and walk around the site, we field survey it, map, describe the wetland habitats, the vegetation on them, and you might also notice that at least our initial focus was on coastal wetlands because these hadn't been covered by the sort of existing information. So we started off looking at the coastal wetlands and got pretty good ground survey coverage of those areas, and then since then we've been having a sort of a closer look at inland wetlands, and yeah, made a bit of progress there, but as you can see, still some way to go. So when we've done our field survey, we delineate the wetland extent, and we're trying to use like standard methodologies that have been developed for New Zealand wetlands and wetland ecologists over the last 10 or so years So there's a standard technique for delineating wetland extent. It relies on plant species composition. There's a list of plants that are characteristic of wetlands, and if the abundance of those species reaches a threshold, then we'd say, okay, this is a wetland. Because obviously, well not obviously, but what happens in nature is that things are actually on a gradient or a spectrum, and that humans come along and try and sort of, classify things. So to help with that, they've just developed this sort of list of species and a sort of a mathematical formula you can apply to say, okay, this is a wetland, this isn't, this is where it becomes not a wetland. So yeah, we do that. We classify the wetland, as I've discussed earlier, bog, fen, swamp, marsh, following the standard methodology. And then we also do assessments of the wetland condition and threats, again using another standard method that's been developed by land care research scientists. And then finally, we do an ecological significance assessment of our wetland using the regional policy statement criteria. And all this information is put into a GIS database. So that's the survey and monitoring program as we've been sort of carrying it out over the last 10 or so 12 years. And it does have some challenges with it. The main one being the size of the task versus the staff and resources available to carry it out. And the other challenge that some of you will be aware of is getting access onto private land to carry out these ground surveys. It's not something that many private landowners are terribly comfortable with. So what we've sort of been thinking in the last year or so as a sort of way forward is to have a split or two-level regional monitoring program. And we do sort of a more of a broader regional whole of region monitoring of wetland location and extent, so using remote sensing and aerial survey techniques, just to see where the wetlands are. Does that change over time? But without collecting any more detail than that. And then combine that with sort of more of a focused ground-based survey assessment for particular sites of interest, such as maybe project areas that biodiversity team have been supporting. So we want to sort of monitor those sites more closely and try and report on biodiversity outcomes for the whatever management that might have taken place, say installation of a fence or weed and pest control. And then there's also a number of other sites of interest around the region that we have monitored in the past and want to keep monitoring, such as the coastal wetlands and sites like Te Waihora margins, Wainona, some of those areas. And we generally don't have access to those areas is not problematic either. So the national and regional perspective. Overall, the pattern of wetland loss and reduction in the region as a whole is more or less consistent with the country as a whole. There's an oft-quoted figure of 90% loss of wetland extent across New Zealand, and Canterbury as a region aligns pretty closely to that. And as I mentioned earlier, it's largely driven by the massive clearance of the formerly very extensive swamps and marshes on the low plains. So in that regard, the pattern of development and land use change and wetland loss can be seen in many other parts of the country. But in some ways, well, in a couple of areas, Canterbury differs from not all of the rest of the country, but certainly many other regions in a couple of respects, with respect to sort of what's happened with wetlands more recently. And the first one of the differences is that at least until 1995 or so, there were still extensive wetlands in parts of the region. So that's sort of western part of the region. So we still had lots of wetlands left. The other difference is that wetland loss is continuing. So that part of the region and those wetlands are the ones that are continuing to be impacted by land use change. And so what we're seeing now in the last 10, 15, 20 years is a concentration of continued wetland reduction and loss, and it's concentrated now in the high country intermontane basins, the valley floors of those inland river valleys, the upper Rakaia, the upper Rangitada. But also, there is still some wetland loss continuing on the low plains, and where that's been happening is the margins of the braided rivers where they cross the low plains. So I'll just talk a little bit more about those sort of two sort of key areas where wetland loss is still going. So this is, apologies again for the slide quality, but this is a high country situation. This is a wetland area in 2008, I believe, not far from Omarama. So the blue outline is the freshwater ecosystems of New Zealand outline of this wetland. So it was in the national wetland layer. It's a substantial wetland area. And as you can see, the aerial photo of the wetland in 2008 pretty much aligns with what Fens had said where the wetland was. This is the same site in 2013, so it speaks for itself really. There's been some land development, farm intensification, and massive loss of that wetland. And this is just one example. I mean, there's dozens of examples of similar sort of thing up and down the region in these sorts of inland basin environments. And yeah, the other area where wetland loss is going ongoing wetland loss is the margins of the braided rivers and the low plains. So as we all know, the low plains have been intensively developed for a long time, but the margins of the braided rivers are less so. But again, some of you will also be aware that again in the last sort of 20 to 25 years or so, there's been a sort of a land use change in those areas that had formerly been either not farmed or were only sort of lightly grazed or lightly farmed. And these land areas have been converted to more intensive agricultural use. Across the region as a whole, sort of more than 10,000 hectares, in fact, of undeveloped low plains river margins converted to intensive agricultural use over the last 25 years or so. Now, not all of these 10,000 hectares are wetlands. In fact, the majority of it isn't, but they all do contain wetland habitats. The wetlands in these areas tend to be sort of linear, sort of long and narrow. They tend to be associated with springs, tributaries, overflow channels of the riparian margins. And the slide shows the lower Waitaki River, and I've just highlighted areas that have been developed for agriculture since 1990. And so just to look a bit closer at this site here, what it looked like before. No one's saying it's a pristine indigenous ecosystem. It's largely dominated by exotic plant species, but it was a semi-natural system and had those ecosystem service values and biodiversity values that I talked about before. And this is not what it looks like now, but what it looked like after the land use change. And again, this is just one example of many that are just going on. So what does it all mean in terms of our various sort of policy, plan, strategy, objectives? The regional policy statement has policies such as identify and protect wetlands, protect significant areas, protect values of ecologically significant wetlands. The land and water regional plan has objectives such as protect the significant indigenous biodiversity values of natural wetlands. And then we've also got the Canterbury Water Management Strategy, which has a number of specific wetland goals. The 2010 goal is prevent further loss of area of naturally occurring wetlands. The 2015 goal is we've protected all and restored at least 2 significant wetlands in each zone. And there's other goals later on, 2020, 2040, about protecting wetlands. So there has been some positives. I think there's been some really good and substantial examples of wetland creation or restoration in urban areas and on the urban fringe. And you think of sort of places like the regional parks, territorial authority parks, places like Travis Wetland, Waimakariri Regional Park, Otapua Wetland on the outskirts of Timaru. And what we've also seen in the last few years at an accelerated rate is wetlands being sort of restored or recreated in association with subdivision developments. So as the subdivision goes in, these swales are constructed and planted out native species, and they also obviously perform a stormwater and water treatment function. There's also been a reasonably significant increase in wetland area around parts of the sort of lower Waimakariri River, Brooklands Lagoon area in association with sort of post-earthquake subsidence. So there's been changes in bed levels and some quite substantial increases in wetland areas on these lowland and coastal sites. And this is just a shot of another example, a newly constructed stormwater retention wetland on the outskirts of Lincoln. So in terms of sort of low plains and that sort of urban and peri-urban sort of situation, I think there's a lot of good news. But I think overall, however, across the region as a whole, I'd have to sort of conclude that our current programs of, well, regional council and local authority programs of education, public awareness, encouraging voluntary protection, and our RMA provisions, plans, policies, rules, enforcement, compliance monitoring, all these things together haven't halted the loss of naturally occurring wetlands in the Canterbury region. And our objectives in the RPS and CWMS to maintain and protect wetlands are not on track. And that's why that's my conclusion. And I acknowledge Mark and Morella and the Land Resources team, and also Tamsin Page, who helped either knowingly or unknowingly with a lot of the material that went into this presentation. Thank you.
Great. Just a further apology about the light. We tried for quite a bit to get it better, but it's simply the amount of sunshine we've got coming in through these skylights. We couldn't do much about that. So, yeah, thank you, Philip. Questions, please? Discussion topics.
The obvious question. What are the rules that aren't working in the plans? There must be some rules to protect those values given the plans and policy statements. So where is it falling through the cracks?
There's probably other people in the room who can answer that better. I must admit I'm not completely au fait with the rules and policies. But my look at particularly the land and water plan, I actually thought it did a pretty good job of closing the loopholes that had existed under the NRRP, because the NRRP had a wetland chapter, but it really only talked about wetland drainage. And what's happened with the land and water regional plan is we've also now sort of covered the issue of vegetation clearance within wetlands. So I think in terms of the plan, it's actually been an improvement. I guess the question now is applying those rules and the compliance monitoring side of things. Yeah.
Yes.
So if we're going to do something significant to restore wetlands, where would we get our best return on effort?
The best return on effort is to protect the ones you've already got. And I don't mean to, I will answer your question, but I just think, just philosophically, or just from an economic point of view, in terms of cost-benefit analysis, it's much better to invest your resources in protecting what you already have than to try and restore something. But in terms of restoration, and your question, obviously the obvious area to restore is where the greatest loss has occurred in the past. So we're talking about the low plains, the coastal environment, particularly the lowland plains. And I think those last few examples, like as we all know, Christchurch and the surrounding area was wetland, and what we're seeing is some quite substantial wetland restorations going on, generally in association with new urban developments. So more of those, and then also work within just parks and reserves, be they TAs or local authority areas. Lots of potential for wetland restoration in those areas.
Right.
So you're talking about protecting the existing wetlands. Are, I guess, the invasive species and pests an issue, and what kind of things are you talking about?
The question about invasive species and wetlands, are they also an issue for protecting wetlands? They certainly are. I think it's important to distinguish, I guess, the wetland habitat from an indigenous wetland habitat. Wetland habitats as a whole have values that I'll sort of touch on in terms of ecosystem services and fauna habitat. But what we need to do is sort of clarify, I guess, in our own thinking, where to focus efforts in terms of controlling invasive species. Like the main threat to native wetlands or wetlands with native vegetation is grey willow, I think, in my opinion, because it basically gets into these areas and totally transforms the nature of the habitat. So if an area has got native vegetation and it's habitat for native fauna, it's really important to keep things like grey willow out of those wetlands. But if you've got another wetland area which turned into willow forest, maybe 50 years ago, it can sometimes be counterproductive to go in and flatten all those willows, because there's actually, it has actually got other habitat values. Those big old willow trees can be roosting habitat for birds, bats. The water underneath the willows, it's habitat for native fish, animals and plants. So it's a matter of, weeds and pests are a big issue, and it's a matter of focusing your efforts on the native or indigenous systems and keeping the invasive species out, while recognising that in other areas, other situations, those species, can have a useful role. So it's not a sort of cut and dried thing.
Yeah, I'm really interested in constructed wetlands. Is there any projects or scope for that in the Canterbury region? Has anyone done a great constructed wetland to deal with anything? Because that's a great idea to increase area and.
Yeah, I know constructed wetlands, they sure are. It's not something I know a lot about. I mean, there's people at MIWA and a guy in the Hamilton office called Chris Tanner who's a specialist in constructed wetlands. But I mean, I'd suggest talking to some of the local authorities, because constructed wetlands are now becoming a part of their land use consent conditions. So there'll be, it's not something I know a lot about, but maybe the drainage engineers or whatever at Selwyn District about the constructed wetland that's just gone in on the outskirts of Lincoln, or maybe the wetlands that have been sort of built as parts of and associated with new housing developments like we see sort of around Hawthorne and other parts of the city fringe. So probably the TAs might be the best people to sort of follow that up with and find out a bit more about what they've done and who they've sort of talked with about developing those constructed wetlands.
What about like the coastal squeeze from coastal erosion in farmland, and then that small strip of coastal wetlands slowly literally being lost? Is there any way or strategy to manage that?
Well, you're absolutely right. It's probably not quite my area. We've got Bruce and coastal scientists and others, but I mean, there's an ecologically sort of obvious strategy, but I guess it's in terms of there's existing people who live on these places. But yeah, the coastline's retreating, as many of us know, particularly in South Canterbury, and those wetlands which form behind those coastal barriers, as the barriers move inland, the wetlands get smaller and smaller because they're pushed against developed land, be it city or farmland. And the phrase that's often used is coastal retreat. So, the developed land, be it urban or industrial or rural farm use, should retreat inland, and wetland can be allowed to spread inland and occupy those habitats and perform those useful functions in terms of protection from erosion, that sort of thing. So that's in an ideal world, I guess that's what would happen. But we're not. We're in the real world, and we're dealing with people and their livelihoods and their houses and their property, and yeah, it's a big challenge, I think, in terms of just policies and plans and that sort of thing. So a real challenge for resource management.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very interesting. To me, it seems absolutely vital that we need to protect all of the remaining wetlands that we have. So in your opinion, do we need to change the rules and make them more stricter? What would you suggest? How can we actually stop this?
Everybody hear the question. It was, we need to protect remaining wetlands, and in my opinion, do we need to change the rules to better protect them? I think I touched on this earlier. I think the rules are okay, but they just aren't being maybe implemented as in a sort of coherent and coordinated way. And I think that probably just comes down to limitations in terms of the people who do that work. They've got lots of other demands on their time. There's lots of other areas of resource management that they're looking into and trying to, do enforcement or compliance monitoring programs. So the wetlands sometimes fall through the cracks. I mean, I guess from my point of view, I think with some of the slide examples that I've shown, using aerial photography, remote sensing, I think is a useful way on a regional scale to sort of keep track of what's happening with wetlands. And if as part of our sort of compliance or enforcement processes, that sort of information could actually be used, that might make some progress. Because at the moment, in my experience, what happens is the only time I go out to sort of help the enforcement guys out with a wetland issue is generally it's been a complaint that's just come in through the pollution hotline. Whereas what we often see is things go on, just slowly and incrementally, and no one really notices. And then suddenly you look at a photo from then, and then you look at a photo 5 years later and you go, hang on, something's happened here. But in terms of our processes, and anyone else is willing to jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like that's not something we sort of respond to. It's more, you know, you've only got the capacity to respond to sort of immediate events, so that sort of incremental and progressive change doesn't seem to get picked up on so much. But I'll sort of hand it over maybe to the floor in a way for following up on some of these points.
I've talked, but I'm just wondering about, obviously land users own most of these wetlands. That's the reality, isn't it? That the ones that we're losing are owned by land users. And are there any people that are particularly valuing or appreciating their wetlands and are actually sort of sold on the idea of keeping them? And how could that idea be spread throughout those land users?
Did everyone hear the question? That's just, yeah, okay, I think I did, thank you. Yes, there are. There's the answer. There are people who value and want to keep their wetlands, but I think, on a regional scale, money talks, and it's just the economic drivers for land use intensification and including wetland development are so strong that you can't rely on altruism. That small minority of people, or maybe that fortunate minority in terms of maybe their financial situation or personal circumstances, they can make those kind of decisions, but a lot of people aren't in that situation or don't see themselves in that situation. They've got debts, they've got mortgages, and they need to intensify the land use and intensify production. And that's our sort of agricultural model, and it's a pretty hard one to sort of fight against in terms of like a voluntary approach. I think that's why you need to have rules, clear rules, and they need to be sort of enforced. And I think, and sort of psychologically in my mind, I think it's useful to think, I think people often think of wetlands in terms of biodiversity values, and the biodiversity values are important and they're there, but there's I guess a range of opinion, it's fair to say, about the role of regulatory versus non-regulatory mechanisms to protect biodiversity values. But I think if we look at wetlands as a habitat, and particularly as a water body, just like a stream or a lake or a river, it's part of a catchment, it's much more sort of tangible that what happens in a wetland there is going to affect the wider catchment. And so in that respect, the role for sort of regional rules and regulation is a stronger argument perhaps than just biodiversity values, which there is differences of opinions on what's the best way to sort of manage biodiversity values on private land.
So you've spoken quite a bit around rules, which Phil Wood's spoken a bit about in the past. I was wondering if there might, in your mind, be a more effective tool if as a society we decide that wetlands are something critical that we need to protect, and just like water bodies, possibly the right answer is a public purchase of those land areas. How different would that be to essentially a rule type framework where if we got a public body like DOCA, and would that protect and defend those values that were present within wetlands?
I think it would. I think taking sort of environmentally or ecologically important areas and putting them into public ownership, it's not a cure-all, there's still issues with weeds and pests and that sort of thing, as we all know, but there's no argument that land, wetlands and other ecosystems in public ownership, there's a lot more security and certainty about protecting the biodiversity values and habitat values of them. So yeah, I'd be in favour of it. Of course, the question is how do you resource it, of course.
Yeah, and I guess as a bit of a follow-up, I guess there's two other parts to that I kind of want. What's your, how do we determine which ones are the most important of the wetlands? And secondly, in terms of in your head again, in terms of an efficiency and effectiveness type thing around public purchase, non-statutory versus regional rules, how do you rank what? So firstly, how do you decide which is the most important, and then secondly, how do you decide which is the most effective regulatory intervention, or is it always just a mixture of all of those things?
I think these are all good questions, and I really don't have the answers. I mean, all I could say is that what we've been doing up till now, which is a mix of regulatory and non-regulatory mechanisms, hasn't been working. So something's got to change, and maybe it's just shifting things around and just tweaking. But yeah, it's difficult, certainly from just a monitoring point of view. I haven't done the kind of study where I've been able to make any sort of scientific comparison between, certain regulatory versus non-regulatory mechanisms in terms of achieving wetland protection. I'm sorry, and I don't know if anyone would have that information really, but it'd be really useful to have it because that's what we need to inform these sort of debates.
Got time for just one more question. So
This isn't so much a question, but
Okay.
that is that, so I think you do have mechanisms for determining significance, and that question about the importance of intervals.
Yeah, that's quite right. The earlier part of Andrew's questions, there are well-established mechanisms certainly for determining ecological significance of wetland areas, and I think you could talk to, hydrologists and aquatic ecologists, and they have their own sort of processes and criteria for ranking wetlands as well. So I think the important thing is to consider all the values, not just the vegetation, for instance, but also the aquatic values that are associated with wetlands, the ecosystem services values that are associated with wetlands, just flood attenuation, all the range of values, and get a really informed opinion on what are the most significant sites. And often the largest wetlands are the most significant in terms of those sort of values, and that's probably fairly obvious. Yeah.
final quick question from Rich.
Yeah, Phil, there's been a lot of talk about the fact that we are struggling to enforce the rules, and that is true. We are really, really struggling to enforce the rules around wetlands. And of course the reasons are, a lot of it has to do with politics. In the face of the land values, as you point out, there is such big stress on these marginal areas. We see the creep up into the high country that you've now beautifully documented. And the only real way is either to purchase them, prohibit the activity, to my mind, and until we do that, we won't arrest this. We just simply can't, through the Resource Management Act, arrest it. And until there's a political will to do that, either finance it or prohibit it, then the decline is just going to continue.
Go to the final word.
No, I think that was the final word, but I'll just say thanks very much for your attention and your questions, and just the opportunity to talk about wetlands with you all. And I'm certainly happy to have one-on-one discussions or maybe smaller group meetings. I know the consents people couldn't be here today, and so if anyone, any team or section wants to follow up on these discussions a bit more, then just give me a call or an email.